Hello everyone, I'm Raisa. The book I picked for reading and reflection and going to share with you today is Stranger Country. Stranger Country can be considered as a travel journal, where the author, Monica Tang, documented the gritty reality of a 30,000-kilometer road trip, and also the solo physical exploration of remote Australia and her profoundly intellectual exploration of identity, environment, and belonging. Monica Tang is a youngish Chinese Australian female who wanted to gain a deeper understanding of what it meant to be an Australian and whether she could ever identify as such. This book provides a tender and thought-provoking exploration of culture and national identity. Monica's realistic descriptions and reflection on indigenous communities in this book are an incredibly valuable lesson for people like me who don't feel a sense of belonging to this country at the moment, and don't have a deeper understanding of the multiplicity of histories in Australia. Because of where we come from, every individual of us actually brings in the richness of Australian culture. Monica writes, the continent is a mosaic of over 500 indigenous nations, each with its own distinct language, cultural practices, history, and experience of colonialism. In much of the book uncovered the multiculturalism of Australia's colonial history, and that has been swept to the corners of the national story. Similarly, the needs of Indigenous students in education are often not valued by the teachers from the mainstream cultural background. Extending from this book to inclusive education, the book I would like to discuss is not the richness of multiculturalism of Australia, or of the educational settings, but I would like to discuss how different groups fit in with each other. To be specific, how teachers can fit in the remote community and better create a meaningful learning journey. One of my teaching placements was in a very remote community, and I requested of my own accord because I was interested in learning more about the perspectives of cultural understood notions of remote Australia and, more importantly, the realities and the laws of survival in remote education. From my experience, I don't think the community would exclude any teachers firsthand, as they know that teachers are there to offer knowledge and wisdom to the next generation. Most likely, the teacher is the one who cannot bear the changes in working and living style or surrounding environment, then quit the game. Monica writes, I wanted to learn about Indigenous Australia as I travelled, having knowledge that, like most Australians, I knew not nearly enough. But I was afraid that wherever I went, I would be here and Indigenous people over there. The gulf between us is unbridgeable. The significance of inclusive teaching and learning in Australia is to identify in all its complexity and diversity. In Indigenous education, it is a question of how to put ourselves in the right mindset as contemporary educators to respect and embrace the differences outside the school and to provide teaching and learning that is responsive to the needs of Indigenous students within schools. Before visiting a real Indigenous community, I could only try to generalize the reasons why Indigenous education was lagging behind mainstream education from the educational reports. I naively thought that the lagging behind in education simply because students were learning in a second or even third or fourth language, in other words, a language gap. And it may also because students had some physical obstacles that prevented advanced learning, such as hearing impairments and attention deficits. But when I went to teach in an Indigenous community, I realized that the entire design and implementation of the curriculum was struggling to match their needs in order to achieve a balance, but that was never close to being achieved. This can explain with the term deficit disclosure we covered in this research unit. Deficit disclosure refers to those language and terms used to blame people who show specific weaknesses. In the educational setting, it usually targets those deficits or external weaknesses attached to the student, such as family background or physical deficit. Such language is aimed to exclude a certain group of people in their view, mainly accusing someone of being abnormal, and they are not supposed to be like that. However, those deficit judgments are based on what being normal in their understanding. While the existence of problems in the Indigenous community and the students themselves was certainly one aspect, another aspect that I overlooked at the time that actually needed urgent reflection was the school practices and the mentality of the resident teachers toward teaching and learning. After conversations with experienced principals and teachers, I found that I received two completely different and even opposite voices. Principal and the education system behind them would prefer administrative changes to fast-track the spread of education in Indigenous communities, so that schooling is more widespread and has a greater impact. Teachers who have lived in Indigenous community for longer periods of time take this lightly, as if they are used to the big plans of educators who come and go from the big cities. and they do not think that those theories and plans of these educators will be successful. I remember one of the most memorable quotes from one of the teachers was, "You can't change anything. The only thing you can change is yourself." Remote education is not working towards closing the gaps. And to me to say closing the gap means that you are using wide standards to measure Indigenous students. What I have experienced is that Indigenous students and their communities don't concern themselves with the gap of education. Education for them, other than literacy, where they learn to read and express themselves using languages including English and their traditional language, is all about self-development in all range of life skills and ability at their own pace, but not about closing any sort of gap. To achieve inclusive education, as outsiders, we need to learn to sit, listen, and observe. We cannot try to change them into one of us, but listen and behave in respect, and a whole new world will open itself. It always been and always will be. Thank you for watching. I personally highly recommend all teachers or those people who work in this field to have a closer look at this book, Stranger Country. Go visit one remote community and stay there for a couple weeks. You will find a whole new world and whole new yourself.